upcoming lectures. There's a flyer there that you can take, and you'll see all the lectures that are coming up between now and October. So let's see, the next lecture will be June 19th, and it does say this on the flyer, but that lecture will be in the Fine Arts Building here at CSI in the small theater. It will not be here. And so just make note of that. And then all of the other lectures are held here. So we're glad that you've come tonight. We're glad to have our speakers and our panel. This is a timely discussion on immigration. And our goal tonight is really to share some various perspectives on immigration. It's a complicated issue. We have a great group of speakers and panelists, and I really appreciate them being here. You'll see a card on your seat when you sat down, a little index card, and we'll be having a Q&A. Most of the evening will be question and answer. And so you can write your question on there, and we will have people that come and collect them. And just hold your card up after you write your question down. We'll come gather those, and we'll hopefully get to all the questions that we have. So to begin with, I'm going to show you a brief little video. This is from 1980, and I'll just comment briefly after we watch this video.
Yes, my name is David Grossberg, and I'd like to know, do you think the children of illegal aliens should be allowed to attend Texas public schools free, or do you think that their parents should pay for their education?
Who are you addressing that to?
I think you're first in this.
He was looking right at you. I said he was. Look, I'd like to see something done about the illegal alien problem that would be so sensitive and so understanding about labor needs and human needs that problem wouldn't come up. But today, if those people are here, I would reluctantly say I think they would get whatever it is that they're, what the society is giving to their neighbors. But the problem has to be solved. The problem has to be solved because as we have kind of made illegal some kinds of labor that I'd like to see legal, we're doing two things. We're creating a whole society of really honorable, decent, family-loving people that are in violation of the law, and secondly, we're exacerbating relations with Mexico. The answer to your question is much more fundamental than whether they attend Houston schools, it seems to me. I don't want to see if they're living here, I don't want to see a whole thing of 6- and 8-year-old kids being made, one totally uneducated and made to feel that they're living with outside the law. Let's address ourselves to the fundamentals. These are good people, strong people. Part of my family is a Mexican.
Can I add to that? I think the time has come that the United States and our neighbors, particularly our neighbor to the south, should have a better understanding and a better relationship than we've ever had. And I think that we haven't been sensitive enough to our size and our power. They have a problem of 40 to 50% unemployment. Now, this cannot continue without the possibility arising with regard to that other country that we talked about, of Cuba and what it is stirring up, of the possibility of trouble below the border, and we could have a very hostile and strange neighbor on our border. Rather than making them or talking about putting up a fence, why don't we work out some recognition of our mutual problems, make it possible for them to come here legally with a work permit, and then while they're working and earning here, they pay taxes here. And when they want to go back, they can go back, and they can cross and open the border both ways by understanding their problems. This is the only safety valve right now they have with that unemployment that probably keeps the lid from blowing off down there. And I think we could have a fine relationship, and it would solve the problem you mentioned also.
So I thought that was an interesting video, noting that was in 1980, and the conversation has not changed much in 45 years. So with that, I'm going to introduce our moderator for the evening, and then he'll kind of introduce the rest. Kelly Anthon is a 7th-generation Idaho native raised on a family farm in Declo, Idaho, where his family continuously operated a farm for over 100 years. Senator Anthon is a licensed Idaho attorney. He attended the University of Idaho's College of Law, where he was elected the college's student body president and named the College of Law's 2002 Bisline Scholar by the Idaho Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. Until 2012, he practiced law at the Rupert law firm of Robinson, Anthon, and Tribe, where as a partner, he focused on local farmers as well as municipal law, debt restructuring, bankruptcy, and large business reorganization. He stepped away from his law firm to take the position of city administrator in Rupert, Idaho. Kelly is fluent in Japanese, and he previously worked as a consultant for Japanese companies, and today he functions as an intermediary between Idaho, Japanese companies, and the Japanese Consul General stationed in Portland, Oregon. In addition, he directs a large potato fresh pack company, the Mart Group, as a member of its board of directors, and has taught as an adjunct professor at the University of Idaho College of Law. He currently serves as a board member with the Southern Idaho Development Organization and as a board member of the Region 4 Development Corporation. Kelly was appointed in 2015 by Governor Butch Otter to fill a vacancy in the Idaho State Senate and has been reelected for 4 more terms. He currently holds the esteemed position of President Pro Tem of the Idaho State Senate. Kelly is married to Joelle Rogers Anthon from Rupert, and together they have 5 children. So I'd like to welcome Senator Anthon.
Well, that was a very nice and long introduction. I'm sorry you had to sit through that, but it is surely nice to be with you tonight. And I think Chanel did a really good introduction by saying this is a complicated issue that we're going to be discussing tonight. It's an issue that has not gone away since 1980. And so I think it's good for us to be gathered as a community to have a dialogue about it. We're going to have to continue to face it and discuss it. One thing I've learned being in the Senate is that reasonable minds can disagree. And I say that often inside the Republican Party, because when I get behind closed doors with fellow Republican senators, I have to remind them of that. We don't agree on some of these issues very well. But when I get here to Southern Idaho, we appreciate this issue probably better than other places in the state, to be honest with you. We understand how this issue interplays with our communities. I represent a district that has a very large Hispanic population, some of which is made up of illegals. But the city of Rupert, where I work, I think last I checked, was over 40% Hispanic. I was formerly the city attorney for the city of Minidoka. Did you know there was a city of Minidoka? When I worked there, I think I was city attorney for 13 years there. They paid me $50 a month. It was honestly one of the best jobs I ever had. I just loved going out there. It was the most Hispanic city council in the state of Idaho. A couple of the members didn't speak English very well. I loved working out there. It was such an honor. The last election they had only 14 voters. So that just gives you a flavor of my district. So there's a special place in my heart to try to solve some of these issues that we have in Idaho. So I've been asked to moderate a little bit, and the first task I've been given is to introduce our first speaker. And before we go into the question and answer and some of the dialogue tonight. So it's my honor to first introduce Mr. Jeff Wasden. Jeff serves as the president and CEO of State Business Executives. Mr. Wasden formed that organization to bring together leading executives from states from diverse industry sectors and trade associations in order to focus on some of our nation's biggest challenges. Prior to leading this organization, Mr. Wasden served as the president of the Colorado Business Roundtable. The Colorado Business Roundtable is a leading statewide business organization operating as an affiliate of the National Business Roundtable. Mr. Wasden has served as a national trustee for the board of directors for the National Small Business Leadership Association, and he understands the importance of collaboration, partnerships, and multipliers, and he works tirelessly to support business. Jeff serves on state leadership councils for United States Global Leadership Coalition, Engage Cuba, Office of Consumer Counsel, Fix the Debt, Ready Nation, and countless other organizations. Previously, Jeff served on the board of directors and the board president for Highlands Ranch Community Association for 10 years. Mr. Wasden has also served on numerous Chamber of Commerce boards and a variety of other policy and committee leads throughout his career. Previously, Jeff served in the education arena. While in education, Mr. Wasden was named Distinguished Educator for LPS and Teacher of the Year. Jeff has been named the Volunteer of the Year and also awarded the prestigious Community Leader of the Year award as well by the South Metro Denver Chamber of Commerce. So this is a man who has had much experience in the business community, in the education world, and also just serving the community generally. So it's my honor to introduce to you Jeff Wasden.
Well, thank you for that wonderful, kind introduction. It is truly an honor to be here, first and foremost. I had a warm welcome on my way in as somebody tried to run my brother over in the parking lot. The Wasden name is well known here for those of you that may not recognize that name. Let's see if we can get this slideshow to advance. So there are a lot of famous Wasdens in Idaho. Some of you recognize Lawrence Wasden, who served many distinguished terms. There's somebody that lives around the corner from my brother, Mark Wasden, who's an attorney in this town. And then the next slide, you're going to see the not so distinguished educator in the family, Mark Wasden, who is right here at CSI. So it's great to be here. But you guys just get me. So it's still a Wasden at least, but maybe not one of the famous Twin Falls or Idaho Wasdens. I have the honor and privilege of representing this organization that was referenced in the introduction called State Business Executives. We are steeped in policy. And the idea behind State Business Executive was really to create this different multidisciplinary, multi-sector, state-led organization that really focused on issues. DC is wonderful for coming together, ad hoc coalition-based. They can bring the chamber, the business roundtable, trade associations to solve big issues. And we do a good job at that. The Trump's Tax Cuts and Job Acts, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS Act. You could go down the line where industry came together. But the challenge is we all recede back to our individual sandboxes, and DC is very isolated and siloed. As I mentioned, we work on policy, all this stuff that's really easy to solve, like trade and tariffs. You may have heard a little bit about that in the news recently. Regulatory reform, trade policy, again, that we talked about, immigration, education, workforce issues. One of the things that we get to do at State Business Execs is work on this immigration issue, and we're currently running a 7-state regional grant with 7 western states, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Texas, where we get to focus on these particular issues. Yeah, you bet. So as we continue to focus on some of these issues, we really try and find what are some of the key tenets of immigration reform that the business community can get behind. Securing borders, portable merit-based visas, efficient, effective legal immigration system, protection for DACA, TPS recipients. As you well know, and it was brought up multiple times here in southern Idaho, the agriculture dairy reforms that are so needed with our current visa system, expanding legal pathways that fill these critical labor shortages with essential workers. So as we start thinking about what's next for us, the video is perfect because that last time we really passed meaningful immigration reform was President Reagan in 1986. As we continue to focus on these issues, immigration has been like pushing rocks up the hill. It is complex. There are some in DC that do not want to solve this issue. It's a wedge issue that keeps on giving and giving and giving. There are others that can't get past their own ideological viewpoints on this particular issue that make this so vexing and problematic. But I'm a firm believer that DC has not lost the ability to walk and chew gum at the same time, that we can actually address complex issues. They may not be easy, but there are things that we can certainly do to solve those. So we approach this from a business, industry, economic focus, that this does matter, that while Trump is waging war on illegal immigration, trying to secure the borders, the data actually tells us a very different story about the economic contributions that are happening within the immigrant community. The critical, essential workers and jobs that are being filled, the high-skilled workers that are being filled. As we start to think through this presentation today, as we start to hear the panelists there that are talking about the real life issues that they deal with each and every day within their own industries, you'll start to understand why this issue is so important to the business community. So as we start thinking about why this particular issue matters to us, studies will show that this is a $7 trillion increase in GDP and potentially up to $1 trillion in additional government revenue over the next decade. When you think about that and you juxtapose what mass deportation looks like into the business community and taxing revenue from local communities, special districts, state governments on up, you're not only exacerbating an issue, but you're creating a bigger hole than we're trying to solve. So elections matter. Elections have consequences. We all know that. So here we now have Trump 2.0, and immigration became a central focus of his administration and his campaign. They focused on this issue quite heavily. It is one of the reasons why I think many people believe that Donald Trump is here again in the White House because of this particular issue. He came into the White House with some very, very specific issues. I know it looks like there are some very challenging, chaotic, difficult issues going on, that it looks like a circus back in DC. And to the outside observer, it may. But they came in with a very disciplined, very intentional approach to the work that they're doing. Trump 1.0, I think, was struggling to understand how government in DC worked. Trump 2.0 does not have that problem, and they are very intentional in some of the things that they're trying to accomplish. So, what is he doing in the immigration space today? Widespread use of executive orders, which is an area that we in the business community do not like and would like to see Congress actually take care of their responsibilities and solve some of these critical issues once and for all. Deportations, securing the border, heavy focus on use of the military, remaking the asylum laws and processes that you're seeing, the use of the IRS and some changes that are now there, changing around temporary protective status, DACA dreamers, and now you're starting to see some influx and some use potentially of DOGE and how that may come into this particular department with DHS as well. Trump came in with a lot of executive orders on day one, and you start to think about what those stakes are and what that looked like and some of the things that he wanted to do on the executive orders as he came in. First, declared a national emergency right at the border. Trying to secure our Border Act, protect American people from invasions, protect the value and meaning of citizenship, trying to obviously designate cartels as terrorist organizations. The list went on. And as we start thinking about where we are with these, he has put out a lot of kind of some media press releases, some hits, talking about some of the successes that they've had. And there's no doubt the border looks incredibly different today than it did under the Biden administration. That area is something that I think he understands that they came in with a very targeted purpose to try and work on, and was quite successful in doing that. As we think through where they go from that, and you start to see, as we're going to roll through some of these quick slides just for your reference, start seeing the use of the IRS and designating folks as deceased, so they can start to remove folks from their roles and start to remove the benefits and the structures that they have. as they start thinking about the use of the military. Flying a military transport is a lot, right, cost inefficient and ineffective than flying some of the traditional transports. But the use of military vehicles, the use of military cargo, the use of National Guard on the troops has a very intentional meaning. You start to see some of the, again, we talked about the financial impacts. I mentioned some of the benefits of immigration, fixing our immigration system, both the illegal and legal immigration system, and what that means. Some folks obviously have estimated a $313 billion gap in revenue from deportations from our immigrant community that has been so critical. And then you factor in the cost of deportation, ranging anywhere from $88 billion to $167 billion per year, to round up by estimates approximately 1 million immigrants. That really goes to areas around hiring new staff, identifying, finding, capturing, and then detaining, and then the cost of deportations back to other countries. The process they're using to help pay and fund for that, as we're going through DOGE and cuts and trying to reduce the size of government, is a little bit of a smoke and mirror to take the money and reduce savings over here and transfer that through reconciliation processes to be able to generate more funds, to be able to utilize that funding stream and revenue to fund his immigration activities. And so that's obviously a very complex issue, and you're going to hear a lot more about reconciliation in the budget. I've already shared some of this in the costs around the impacts. You've now started to see some of the green lighting Trump's administration undocumented immigrant registry, which is another thing that just came out, that we're going to now require all immigrants to formally register into a registry where folks can target, watch, monitor, track, ensure that they're complying legally. You may not have heard about that, but as I was preparing, I was talking to Chanel. This presentation was probably one of the more complex and probably went through the most revisions I've done to give a speech in quite some time, because every day there's a new executive order or a new court order turning or overturning or something going to the Supreme Court. And so you start seeing some things that are popping up on a very daily, real-time basis. As we start moving through there, and I mentioned some of the use of Social Security and the death master file, again, trying to cut off access to credit cards, bank accounts, and other financial services. All, again, very intentional. You've seen the Alien Enemies Act and the use to be able to engage with deportation activities. DOGE now, as I mentioned, now getting into the act as well. So what else is happening? Again, I mentioned some of the milestones. We'll skip over this. Legislatively, there is activity happening in D.C. And so one of the very first bills that President Trump signed was the Lake and Riley Act. You see H.R. 22, one of the areas there around safeguarding America's future, which really is an act designed to protect and ensure that only U.S. citizens are voting. The Dignity Act that has gone through several revisions from Representative Salazar, Representative Escobar, all of those on the heels of the bipartisan Senate compromise legislation that Senator Sinema and Senator Langford were working on. When that stopped pre-election and was killed, what a lot of people didn't understand is two House members picked up that Congressman Tom Suozzi from New York and Congressman Luttrell out of Texas, an R and a D, to try and again continue to work on real meaningful immigration reform. So those activities continue. And then you see the American Families United Act, some pieces of legislation activity that you're seeing it today in DC. So let's get to some of the things that we're doing and where and how we can engage with each and every one of you. Business leaders have a role to play. Right now, if you believe in the Edelman Trust Index, we in the business community are actually respected and trusted more than local politicians, certainly your members of Congress and others. The business voice is critical to move these types of policies forward. As you start thinking about some of the policies that are needed around H-2 visa reforms, around some of the things we want to accomplish with DACA and the Dreamers, around TPS, around some of the legal immigration reforms, and using a real merit-based system and trying to change the cap system for more portable visas, business leaders must engage in these particular issues and be involved. you're starting to see some movement. I was just part of a DC fly-in that was called Secure America's Future. And the use of secure you're going to hear, and something that literally I was on a 2-hour call today with a bunch of business leaders, is very intentional with this administration, right? Because securing the border has been first and foremost within this administration's goals. And so utilizing the Secure America's Future had to do with securing the border, but then also securing America's workforce. We know that there are several folks within the tech sector, within healthcare, that play just as an integral role as some of the critical essential workers that are so needed each and every day to run this community and to deal with all of the things that we know we value in communities and the dignified, pragmatic workforce that drive our economy and ensure that the American business and industry sector drive forward. And so all of these efforts are starting to engage within this administration. And so you're seeing a little softening in some areas and some other realizations within this administration. You can see the date on there, April 10th, from some of the conversations with President Trump, now understanding that we are going to have a very, very big workforce hole when it comes to trying to deal with produce, when it comes with home builders, when it comes with hospital, healthcare, hospitality, restaurant association, farming, ag, cattle, and others. So we're going to continue to advocate. As I mentioned, this was a slide that got put in today because that was, if you see the date, literally yesterday, a judge blocking Trump's legal status of returning 500,000 migrants that came into the country under President Biden and some of his policies that he put in place. Right now, I'm in DC, as you know. I am not from the government, so I can actually try and help on some of these issues. But I should have been an attorney like that other Mark Wasden that's here, because attorneys in D.C. are making a killing right now, and the Supreme Court is going to be one of the heaviest induced workforces as we start thinking about what is going to be on their docket as all these legal challenges continue to roll through the system. So we're going to continue to be very active in that space, both legislatively, following the court systems, advocating with the administration, and thinking about how we augment. As I mentioned, one of the things literally happening today was the Secure Immigration Alliance formation of a new immigration group in DC that really was on the heels of the ANIC coalition. I was talking, as you mentioned, some of the work that we've been doing. We're part of Forward US, we're part of AIC, we're part of the National Immigration Forum, Business Bibles and Badges, ABIC, and all of those leaders came together to form a coalition called ANIC, Alliance for a New Immigration Coalition. That coalition was really designed to continue to drive the business voice, the faith-based group, law enforcement, and other support in creating meaningful, pragmatic immigration reform. That particular group was very left of center in its formation and was very unwieldy. Many of the groups would not take positions on legislative issues, did not lobby or advocate on the Hill, and it became kind of a non-starter with this particular administration. And so we made a decision to close that particular coalition, and today, literally, worked on a Secure Immigration Alliance, which will be a right-of-center immigration group led more by the business community to focus again on recognizing that we need secure borders, that we are a nation of laws, that these are important to us, but there are critical reforms for our workforce that need to happen as we continue to go through here. And I think the last slide on here before we get to the real talent on stage, some of our industry experts. As I mentioned, that regional immigration work, we're putting on a regional immigration summit in Austin, Texas, June 25th, 26th. Idaho is represented. We would love to have you all there in attendance. Chanel can get you my contact information. The agenda is shaping up quite nicely. We will have home builders, farming, ag, produce, folks from the Consulate General's office, several governor's offices in attendance, elected officials. We have invites out to Secretary Brooke Rollins, who's a Texas native, and also to Secretary Kristi Noem as well from DHS. So we're looking forward to continuing these conversations and advocating on behalf of the business community in the interests of ensuring America's global competitiveness. So thank you for having me out here today.
Now, as I understand it here in a moment, we will take questions. Before we do that, as was mentioned, we have other talent. So let me introduce those folks. So Rick Narabout. Many of you know who we have here, but Rick Narabout grew up on his family's farm in Michigan, where he developed a deep appreciation, which happens when you're working on a farm, for agriculture, along with the value of hard work, integrity, which is ingrained in him. And I've worked with him, and I know that's true. After his family sold the dairy and moved out west, he joined with the Idaho Dairymen's Association in 2002, where he's continued to work with them for a number of years to protect the environmental, legal, and economic, legislative, and stewardship efforts for our dairymen here in this area and throughout the state. The IDA was established in 1924. It's quite an old organization and aims to protect Idaho's dairy industry through its environmental, legal, and legislative efforts. In 2017, he became the CEO, leading the association's advocacy on behalf of all of Idaho's dairy farm families. How about a round of applause for Rick? Ken Burgess is already on the stand, described himself as just somebody from Castleford, but let me tell you a little bit about Ken. Ken Burgess is a partner in the Boise-based political consulting firm Veritas Advisors. Veritas is largely a contract lobbying firm focusing on Idaho-based issues. One of the clients that takes much of his time is the Idaho Home Builders Association, which has a chapter here in our area called the Magic Valley Builders Association, which we're familiar with. Ken was born and raised on a farm in the Twin Falls County community of Castleford. He attended the University of Idaho and earned a master's degree in public administration from Arizona State University. Prior to joining Veritas Advisors in 2004, Ken spent 7 years as a U.S. Senate employee, managing the Boise office of then U.S. Senator Larry Craig. Many people in this room will recall that Senator Craig, during his time in the U.S. Senate, worked hard to get passed a piece of legislation that was called the Ag Jobs Foreign Labor Bill, which didn't go where we wanted it to go. Why don't you join me in welcoming Mr. Ken Burgess. Okay, so if you have questions that are written down, or if you want to write questions down, and then if you'll hold those up, someone's going to come around and grab those from you, and we will hear those questions. If you don't have, there's cards there on your chair. I see some of you kind of looking around, but we do want to hear from you if you'd like to ask a question. And it would contribute greatly to the dialogue tonight. So. I'm not seeing any questions yet, so it could be a short dialogue. All right, great. We're working on it, so be patient. We're coming around. Nope. I also want to say thank you for being here tonight. I've never attended one of these meetings, but by all accounts, they're always well attended and well run. And so thank you for the organizers very much, and thank you for being here tonight. Okay. Okay, we'll get going, and I'm sure some of these, please trickle them up here. The first comment is, from the initial video, the remark was made, quote, the conversation has changed. Or, I'm sorry, Chanel had said the conversation hasn't changed all that much since 1980. In the video, the people coming into the country were referred to as good people. I think that was George Bush. The conversation seems to now be about criminals and rapists. How can you say the conversation has stayed pretty much the same. That's not directed. We're not going to make you say too much if you don't. But let's talk about that. I mean, we'll turn to our panelists a little bit. Has the dialogue changed? How has it changed in your career span? And what are the implications of that in how we're talking about policy and how we're seeing the policy, maybe even the administration, tackle the issue?
Yeah.
Rick, why don't you start with us here?
I'll start, and then these guys can play cleanup. So, yeah, I think the tenor of the conversation probably has changed. Some of the adjectives in the conversation has changed. But I think as we look at it from a policy perspective, when you're looking at, access to taxpayer services and impacts to local communities and all of the major policy discussion points, that video could have been the Idaho legislature in 2025 talking about should an unauthorized individual in this country have access to public education. Literally something that was discussed and debated, during legislative session, and something that legislators, wrestled with to varying degrees. So the unfortunate part is, and I was 1 year old when that video was made, and in 45 years we haven't advanced the conversation. We haven't, really begun to solve the problem. We're still debating the same issues, and that's, I think, for us that work in the building and work on these issues is very, very frustrating that, we haven't gotten beyond that, because at its core, the policy discussion and debates haven't changed.
My brother is a professor of communications grading speeches right now, and he so wanted to be here because he was sending some notes over about facts and data and supporting arguments. And I told him I'm from DC. We don't use facts or data or supporting arguments for anything back there because it doesn't fit a narrative. So I completely agree with you. The policy implications haven't changed a whole lot. The things we work on haven't changed as you start thinking about, right, visa reforms and caps and portability of visas and how we work through some of those changes, legal immigration status, that temporary thing called DACA and dealing with Dreamers. It's now 13, 14 years that have passed by. Those policy things on go, but the adjectives, as you mentioned, have certainly changed. But again, it fits a narrative. Talking about deporting families, entrepreneurs, community folks, contributing members of society doesn't fit, doesn't work. And so we use different adjectives to accomplish those types of goals. And I think the challenge is how we bring these conversations back and put the human face and make sure that people understand what good, hardworking, dedicated, family contributing members of society look like, that are job creators, that are contributing to the tax base, that are here to work diligently. We all want safe communities, and I want to make sure that's very clear and understood there. I don't think anybody on either side of the aisle can debate that having a safe community and removing criminal elements from our society is not a good thing, right? But where that line stops with 13 plus million, including probably estimates from Pew about 8 million in the workforce, runs a very different narrative when you're thinking about mass deportations. And so we'll continue to try and focus on the positives and the pragmatic human side of the immigration issue.
Thank you. These gentlemen are both right. Everybody's right. The policy issues really have not changed since 86, really, right? And I think we're still dealing with Rick and I are trying to figure out how we can create, for example, a new visa program that the dairy industry would fall into very easily, or that the construction industry would fall into very easily. I think the adjectives have changed really just in the last 18 months. I mean, Donald Trump ran a campaign that he recognized was an issue that Americans were concerned about, and he got them more concerned about it by using the words that he used. And that resonated well with America, and it may well have been the reason that he got elected this go around. And it resonated well with Idahoans, for that matter, right? And so what we saw in this last legislative session really was a little bit of what I would call some piling on of that in that regard. I counted up before we came down here. There were 9 pieces of immigration legislation introduced in the Idaho legislature this last year. And the very first version, House Bill 11 of what ultimately became House Bill 83, was really a just round everybody up and send them back across the border deportation type of a bill. And we got engaged in that discussion. Senator Anthony was a large part of that, where we ultimately said, look, it is reasonable to really go after the true criminal illegal aliens, right? And certainly no one should be opposed to doing that. But the idea of trying to round up every single undocumented illegal alien, or whatever term you want to use, and trying to get them out here is not a reasonable approach. And I think in the end, with the House Bill 83 that we passed, we ended up with a reasonable kind of a compromise in that regard first, but also it stopped 8 other really stupid ideas that were out there that were going to come. For example, one of them, dealing with education, basically would have required that the public schools in the state of Idaho do a report every year of the immigration status and the nationality of every single child that's in the school. That was one of the bills that got introduced this year. It didn't go anywhere, but that was the mindset, which I think was largely a reaction to and a piling on of the rhetoric that Donald Trump had used. And no doubt the immigration system needs some work. There's no doubt that I think under the Biden administration, the pendulum swung a little too far the other way. But it is, from a policy perspective, really the same things that we've been talking about for 30 years, I think.
Okay, so I'll make a quick comment, and then I'm going to challenge some of what I heard here. So you're seeing the Idaho legislature on the move. And I would say to you, the reason for that is there is pressure at home for each of these legislators, unlike that they've ever seen before, right? I could describe that in other issues. It's not just immigration. I'll give you an example. During COVID, when a legislator went home, their constituents were writing them on COVID. Why aren't you doing something? And you saw in the history of Idaho, the House of Representatives refused to adjourn sine die. Why did they do that? Because they felt compelled to leave the session open so they could go do something about COVID, okay? And so what you're seeing now is, because there's all this pressure on immigration, what you just heard, there are going to be bills on immigration in the Idaho State Legislature, even though in many respects, and maybe all respects, it's a federal issue. And so there's a clamor to see what the state can do about immigration, even though in maybe all respects it's a federal problem, okay? Now, I heard that the dialogue's gotten worse, but the issues have remained the same. So why haven't we fixed it in all these years? Even when the dialogue was beautiful. Even when we were using nicer words back in the 80s. And to be fair, we do know that the Reagan administration did pass some meaningful immigration reform. But if the problem is that we're just using worse language now, okay, fine. But when we were using nicer language, we still couldn't fix the problem. So what is it that's holding up meaningful immigration reform in the United States? I'm going to make Ken go first this time.
Senator Anthony mentioned that when I worked for Larry Craig, we were working on a program that was then called Ag Jobs. And part of that, the crux of that was to try to provide at least some sort of a year-round visa-type program for agriculture. And part of that also involved a path towards citizenship for those who had been here or were here illegally. And one of the biggest hump that we could not get over at that time was this idea of the path to citizenship, mostly because our opponents really were basically calling it amnesty, Well, it really wasn't amnesty, but that was the word they used. That was a nicer word now than what we're using today, I think. And it was just, that was at the beginning of where Congress, in my opinion, and the United States Senate started really veering into this super partisan type of approach to all issues in many respects. That just made that very, very difficult to get over the hump. And I think as we're even more severely, I think, philosophically divided, politically divided, I think, name your issue, but certainly on immigration matters, trying to find a solution to a very, very complicated problem is the biggest issue, I think, at the moment.
Okay, Washington, D.C., let's hear it.
Yeah, there's a loaded question on this one, but a lot of thoughts. We used to think of things around the Overton window and ZOPA, Zone for Potential Agreement, and focusing on issues where you could find compromise, where you could find areas where people would bend and work together on solutions. I think the challenge is that window was closed, and it's my way or the highway, and there's a fundamental issue that if you can't take care of the particular issue, in this case immigration, dealing with the border first, that there's no room to negotiate or fix anything else. There's also a fundamental belief that there's a reshaping of the voter rolls, right? And allowing immigrants into this community will completely rechange and reshape some of the policies, which I think is completely wrong. I've said for years that I firmly believe if a Republican could actually talk about this particular issue in a very humane, articulate way, and you think about the types of individuals that are coming here to fill these critical, essential roles, hardworking, entrepreneurial, family-driven, values, contributing, those are Republican core values, and that's what the immigrant community brings each and every day, and we don't talk to them that way. You hear these words that continue to punt shaping and a framing to fill a particular void to push an agenda forward. Part of this regional immigration work, you talked about the bills here in Idaho, Senate Bill 4 coming out of Texas, right? You're seeing a lot of copycat bills from Texas's legislation that they passed there. So we're trying to think through about the dialogue, the messaging, because talking to legislators on the left or the right are very, very different. The messaging, the nuances, what's their critical values and ideologies around this particular issues, how they view this issue matters. When you think about the challenges today in solving this issue, that's truly a wedge issue, I don't think there's enough people today that want to critically solve this issue, period. And I know that's controversial, and I know we work on this issue every day, but I don't think you have a majority of individuals in Congress today that want to see a solution solved. The amnesty issue, the pathway to citizenship issue, call that whatever you want, filling the voids, the workplace issues, a secure nation, and dealing with that. When you think about the Senate compromise bill from Langford and Sinema that came forward, and you think about making progress on a particular issue since 1986, and you look at that actual bill, when it became a crisis with allowing 4,000, 5,000 individuals in per day, and people thought, well, that's good. It's 6,000 or 7,000, 8,000 per day now, so that'll help stem the flow, to a Republican that says one is one too many because they're breaking the law to get here. How do you find compromise in passing and fixing a particular issue? So you're seeing in D.C. right now, the tenor is focus on secure. You heard that word multiple times today. Secure, 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 secure the border, make sure this president feels success in this particular issue, that he gets the recognition he deserves on this issue, and then we can move into the other areas that matter about securing the workforce for dairy, for home builders, and the things that matter to us.
Okay, so I'm being instructed to try to get through more questions. So, and I know you guys want, there's a lot of questions up here, but if you want to go after that.
They got it.
Well, so, I will tell you that my kind of observation of this is that as I've gone to DC and said you need to reform, it's such a big issue that it depends on the industry. My dad's a cash crop farmer. We didn't have dairy, but we had a program. We could bring labor in from out of the country. It was the H-2A program. You go down the street to the dairy farm, they have no program. It's just there's a lot of counterintuitive things inside the the immigration laws. But when you get to DC, this has been my experience, and you start talking about, you name it, hotels, car manufacturing. There are so many varied interests, and then there are labor unions, and there are all these other factions, and you try to do one piece of legislation to solve this problem, you start throwing the punches, and you can't get everybody at the table on one piece of legislation. And so I think that's why there's been a focus to try to narrow down into just ag, but even that has been very complicated. That's just been my... Okay. Rick, are there people in Idaho or the United States that can fill the jobs in agriculture or dairy or what, or even home building? Or I'm adding now a little bit to this question. So let's just imagine that we deported. What would happen? I mean, we've kind of heard, but do we have the people that can actually fill the jobs? Are we just lazy Americans? I mean, what's going on?
I won't touch that last piece, but I mean, the short answer is no. You look at, pick your month and year in the last decade in Idaho and go to your Department of Labor stats to look at unemployment stats here in the state. And we have, by estimates, 35,000 unauthorized individuals in the state of Idaho. 30,000 of them are filling jobs. We don't have 30,000 individuals here that are going to want to take the jobs. We just don't have the individuals, let alone the desire to take the jobs that they have. And one of the stats that we like to use is from an H-2A contractor, works beyond just Idaho. They do H-2A contracts across the western states. And last growing season, they had H-2A positions for over 6,000 jobs across the western states. One of the requirements of that program is you have to advertise the job to domestic workers so that if there is a domestic applicant, they have to be hired before you can hire an immigrant applicant. And so they advertised their 6,000 jobs across the West. They had roughly 35 applicants for 6,000 jobs. Of the 35 applicants for those 6,000 jobs, they had 12 that actually showed up for an interview. Of the 12 that showed up for an interview, you had 2 that got hired. Of the 2 that got hired, neither made it to harvest. And that is your typical experience when it comes to a domestic workforce in agriculture. These are the jobs that we're talking generations, decades. We have not seen a domestic workforce that has come and desired to fill these jobs. And frankly, they have other opportunities. We have a bigger economy than what our domestic workforce can fill. And so we can either choose to fill jobs with immigrant workers, or we can choose to have a shrinking economy. But those really are the 2 options in front of us if you boil it down to whether you do or don't want to have immigrants in the country.
Go ahead.
Nationwide in the construction industry right now, it is estimated there are 400,000 open positions in the construction industry. That's both home building and commercial construction. And one of the biggest issues that we have in the home building industry is a labor shortage, just generally across the board. On a nationwide basis, about 31% of the workforce that's employed in the home building industry are foreign-born workers. And so that's why we, as the Idaho Home Builders Association, have kind of partnered now with the ag industry to try to help people understand that this is not just an ag industry issue. It's much broader than that. I mean, when we're talking, I have legislators screaming at me all the time about how housing prices in Idaho continue to rise. And, at the same time, we're trying to do what we can just to get a workforce available to get a house done, in the times that we can, and that's the framers, it's the drywallers, it's the landscapers, it's all those folks that we rely on every single day to get that kind of work done. So, the answer is no, there are not enough domestic workers to fill those positions.
Okay, Mr. Wasden, I'm going to give you a twofer. Okay.
All right, fire away.
All right. First of all, there was kind of a question. You had one slide that we kind of went through. There was a series of facts that have happened here recently. So if you just want to summarize that, but I've been somebody who's advocated you close the border. My political stuff's out there, right? Close the border, you reform immigration. But let's say we get there. We really get things tight on the border, which I think is the first step. You get meaningful immigration reform. Do we have the horsepower in D.C. to effectuate it? So you've got millions and millions and millions of people here who have sneaked across the border. We're going to have to sort through them. We're going to have to, even if you're talking deportation, but let's say you're not talking deportation. You're just talking to us, let's find out who's here. Let's, whatever. Do we have the horsepower? Can we practically do that?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned, the whole walk chew gum issue, and it's plaguing D.C. right now. The horsepower is there. The question of whether the willpower is there, and I think those are some of the issues we're dealing with currently. We represent both the farming and ag community, the home builders on our board of directors, manufacturers. These issues are real. My wife works for the Burning Glass Institute, has all the labor data and economics around here, can tell you about the workforce today and the changing demographics, the shrinking workforce, retiring workforce, birth rates. You could go down the line. We have a problem that exists today, and I thought you highlighted that incredibly well, with the number of jobs, the number of applicants, the number of people that showed up, and not one person made it to harvest. We have people that want to come and contribute and take care of their families and work here in this country that will fill those essential roles, those critical roles that drive our economy, that pay taxes, that support local industries, that are shopping at all the mom and pops, Main Street businesses in this country. So I think there's horsepower. You think about E-Verify, you think about all this registry, all of the things that are trying to come around this. It really comes down to this comprehensive immigration reform, peaceful, pragmatic, one-off. How do we solve a particular issue? And so there's that, how do you eat the elephant, right? The 800-pound, one bite at a time, right? We've all tried the comprehensive, and I don't think we were able to be successful in solving it. And so we're trying to really hone in on finding areas of immigration reform where we can actually get wins for the American public, for local communities, for state. The willpower is a very different issue. And I think as we start thinking about how and who and what we elect to go back to Congress, the type of people that we send back there, the pressures that are on local elected officials, local school boards, right? As you start thinking about curriculum and books and banning books and things happening at local levels, being an elected official is tough. And compliments to Chanel and this organization thinking around that particular issue. It starts there, it moves forward. The people we send back to DC have got to not only have the backbone, but the willpower to solve it. I think if we can get the border secured, we can start to address some of these other issues.
Okay. Rick, let's talk a little bit about what taxes are being paid. So, talk to us a little bit about what taxes would an illegal immigrant being paid, are they paying taxes? Are some not paying taxes? And, what of this belief that they're not paying taxes but getting government services, if you know? And let's start there.
Yeah, so probably the starting point of that is the hiring process on a construction site or a dairy or a farming operation. Every employer I know across my membership, they collect all the information to fulfill an I-9 form and have all of that taken care of. They're withholding payroll taxes, so you've got federal and state withholding coming out. You've got your Social Security and Medicare being withheld and paid in both employer and employee side. So you've got all the same payroll taxes that you and I have and you and I pay are being paid by this unauthorized population when they're filling jobs. You also have, whether they're renting or owning a home, you have them paying property tax in one way or another. So you've got property taxes being paid. You have sales tax being paid on all the goods and services that they purchase in our communities. So there are an abundance of taxes paid by this population. The reality is very few of them, you do have a segment of the population, of the unauthorized population, that will go and get themselves a tax ID number as opposed to a Social Security number, and they'll file tax returns and do their tax work based off of that TIN, not a Social Security number, but that's going to be a minority. The vast majority of them don't go file a tax return. So you've got all these withholding taxes paid in. If they've overpaid, they're not filing for a return on that overpayment. Those dollars stay within the system. you don't have the ability for these individuals on retirement to benefit from all the Social Security payments that they've made over their career and all those dollars that they've paid in. So they're buoying the Social Security system to a large degree. And we did, back of the napkin estimates just for Idaho employers, and you're in the hundreds of millions of dollars just in Idaho employers and Idaho jobs paying into that system. So you have an abundance of taxes being paid in and very few benefits that they can draw and receive as a taxpayer. And we saw that get even more difficult this session with some of the bills that were passed. And so, the notion that they're not paying taxes and they're just drawing on the system is a very false notion. And it's very misunderstood that these individuals do pay taxes and are taxpayers within our communities.
Okay, Rick. Oh, well, go ahead, and then I'm going to keep.
Just a real quick note. I think a lot of this narrative comes from the change in the cartels and coyote runners with the asylum process. Folks that come here, that again, to your point, that are doing the work, filling those roles, are paying countless taxes. What you saw play out, whether it was the Martha Vineyard shipment from, whether it was Abbott or DeSantis, folks coming to Vice President Harris's mansion, into New York, Chicago, Denver. Asylum has a very different connotation and set of rules that we're required to uphold. And so there was a complete shift to try and use and ensure that everyone coming across the border was claiming asylum. And so now you've now seen, again, through President Trump right now, a use of claiming land outside of quote-unquote sovereign U.S. territory to stop that process. A fence does not do anything. We could build a 100-foot fence 1 inch onto U.S. property and saying, I claim asylum. We are required to take them in and required to feed, clothe, and take care of. And so the abuses that you were seeing around the hotels and the rec centers and converting properties to house were folks that came in claiming asylum. Asylum was set up for a contiguous country. And as you're trekking through 6 different Central South American countries to get to the United States, it was an abuse of the system. And so you're starting to see this administration saying we need to fix that process. But those that come here, to your point, are paying an enormous share and not getting the return on that benefit.
So, Mr. Wazin, I've heard you kind of mention that part of the reason we may not solve the problem is because people do not want it solved. That there's a certain amount of political gain to be had in not solving the problem. Did I hear that right? Okay. So this question kind of goes to that. And I've noticed a lot of political rhetoric that churns through this issue, and we've seen it in our elections. I've noticed that when you discuss this issue and you discuss it on a hardcore law and order side, you'll run the risk of being called a bigot. And at the same time, there is some bigotry there in some of those arguments, right? So, Rick, I want to ask you. So, how much do you think that racism is playing, and maybe not even racism, right? It's ethnicity bias.
Thanks for the easy one there, Kelly. It is very difficult to sit through some of the debates and the committee hearings that we sit through during session and not come to the conclusion that there is a facet of our population where some of this is coming from a biased or bigoted position. You can't sit in some of the committee debates that we've sat through and not draw that conclusion. So it's unfortunate, but that's the reality of the situation we're in.
Anyone else want to touch it? All right. Does anyone on the panel have experience with the immigration process? What does it look like? How hard is it?
I'll just very quickly, I've been working on this issue from my days back in running policy in Denver and Chamber of Commerce life back then. It really hit home the end of last year when my graphic artist, my web designer, was detained out of country and not allowed to come back to her newborn baby because of an issue on immigration. So luckily, we were able to engage a couple senators' office and fix that. But it changes the face and the issues when all of a sudden it's not talking about broad strokes, but all of a sudden when you're getting a text from your web designer saying, help, I'm being held, I can't get out of Guatemala, I just had a newborn baby, I came down to see my sick mother and take care of her, and I'm not being allowed back in the country. So it puts a different face on these type of issues. And so for me, it became very real than a big policy issue that we're trying to address. But you all may have very different issues.
Well, first of all, I don't know that I have as much experience, at least certainly with utilizing the H-2A program, for example, which is probably one of the ones that's most commonly used in Idaho, and arguably probably one of the better visa systems, even though it's still, I think, very complicated and expensive. Then you've got the H-2B program, which is a temporary non-ag type of approach, which some of our construction guys have used, but they find it to be so complicated, so expensive, and so bureaucratic in nature that really they don't use it at all. The one thing I would want to mention, though, is the E-Verify system. Because as you know, there was a bill introduced in the legislature this year, again, that would have required all employers in the state of Idaho to utilize the E-Verify system. And based on the feedback that I get about the current E-Verify system, it is a complete disaster. And many of our members, and I think many of other business folks around the state, were highly alarmed by that prospect of having to utilize the E-Verify system. But again, just anecdotal, really, from my standpoint.
So, Ken, that leads to the next question. Okay, we know we have these policy problems. How can business influence no, it's not dumb, but how can business influence politicians to do the right thing, to make some meaningful changes? What role does the business community play? Where have you fallen down, if you have? I'm putting words on the card now, but business. Why is business? Where's the play for business here?
Look, we've been advocating and lobbying in D.C. and at state capitals for countless years. We are paid and asked to do this on behalf of our members. But elected officials don't want to hear from Jeff Wasden. They want to hear from you, from the business owner, from the perspective that you bring and how it impacts them. We will be effective when our caucus systems, when our primary voters, when we start realizing that that's the power and we start sending more people to elect as a representative government, when businesses starts to come to DC, when they start to show up at town halls, the advocates on either side, whether you're on the far left and a much more liberal progressive voice or whether you're a Tea Party MAGA type, they show up. It's the folks that are in the pragmatic, thoughtful middle that need to be heard from. The business owners, the people with families that are home working, that are trying to do homework with their kids at night, that are trying to deal with work issues, that are staying late in the office. And amplifying that voice is how we will have a much more effective play back in DC and at local politics as well.
Okay, I want to hear from others, but this next question is right along that. I mean, this question is, how does the average person do that? I mean, you're right, and I've noticed this in the Capitol. You know, your run-of-the-mill Idaho family, they're busy. They're not the ones down there camped on my doorstep, yelling and screaming. They've got kids to feed and soccer games and piano lessons, and they are maybe not always representative of the average Idahoan. But how do those folks, what do they need to do?
That's well said, and I think you know firsthand who is at your door and who's talking to you at town halls, right? And to everybody that took the time to be here tonight, thank you, right? Because you're taking some of your own personal time to come to hear, to learn about an issue, to be educated and informed. As you think about ways that you can effectively advocate on particular issues, write letters, call, find ways that you can engage from home that don't have to be going to DC and a fly-in, which is incredibly costly. Each one of these offices have local district offices in district that you can meet and talk with, that those areas will be sent. You need to find other ways. Write your local newspapers. Send in letters to the editors. Work with your associations. Join the chambers. Advocate with groups and associations. Make sure that voice is being heard. They're advocating on your behalf. And it is hard, right? Running a business is incredibly problematic. It's challenging. It's time-consuming. It's hard. The regulatory burdens and oversights that are placed upon each and every business owner in this room is not only vexing, but it's counterproductive to good, efficient, productive business relations. Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan Chase said we would have much more intense regulatory reforms that would protect consumers if the government would just get out of the way and let us put our own reforms in there. But we have to fill things out in triplicate and quadruple. We have compliance officers and attorneys to the hundreds of thousands working at just one particular bank to comply with federal government. We've got a lot of reforms that need to happen, and one of those is how we interact and advocate on behalf of business and have our voices heard.
I'd argue that we're unique in Idaho, that we have accessibility that you don't see in most other states. I mean, we have you here tonight. You're very approachable. You're going to listen to your constituents. We have Representative Furman from East Idaho, Representative Pohanka from Jerome in District 26 that are here. We've got an aide from Congressman Simpson's office. So we have great accessibility when it comes to individuals that you can go to and be able to voice your concern. And I think we at times take that for granted in Idaho, that we have such accessibility to decision makers. And I would just encourage you, if you want to have those conversations, approach these individuals tonight, talk to them, reach out to them. They're going to be very open to sit down and have the conversation with you and listen to your perspective, because you don't get this in other states. You don't get to have the conversation with the decision maker. You get to have a conversation with a staff member that'll then relay it to a decision maker. So we're honestly pretty unique in the state of Idaho in our access.
I'm kind of old-fashioned, and I have to say that I think that with the advent of technology and social media and podcasts and texts and all that kind of thing, I think it's actually harder these days to actually have one single voice get through to a Senator Anthony in many respects, because there's, you've got the news cycle is no longer even 24 hours, right? It's even shorter than that these days. And I think all that mix and all the communication that you guys have to sort through as it's coming in, I think is in many ways it's diluted the whole message in many respects and made it harder. Now that's easy for me to say because I'm not, one of these young millennials, but I mean, I have 2 apps on my phone. One is to keep my golf scores so I can keep my handicap up to date. And I don't remember what the other one is.
Lobbyists, that's obvious. Bill track. Okay, so the question is, this is political, right? I mean, this is politics in Idaho, and maybe everywhere. But if the dairy industry and the construction industry know that you need this labor, and you know that the Trump administration or the Republicans don't align with you on this issue, maybe arguably. I mean, that's arguable. I mean, I think it's very nuanced. Why are your members supporting conservative Republicans or Trump?
Man, glad I got good teammates up here. It's a fair question, and I think you have to view this from the perspective of a business owner that is not just looking at immigration policy when they're going into the voting booth. They're looking at environmental policy. They're looking at fiscal policy. They're looking at all these other aspects that affect their business and their success as a dairyman or a home builder or another member of Idaho's economy. And so it's not just this simple one issue vote that they take. and then, set aside all the business considerations, then take on their own personal belief system and what they believe internally, and that factors into it as well. And so it's not this easy one-issue decision that they have to make, but they're weighing all these other factors as they're trying to decide, where do we align politically? And, we don't know exactly let's be honest, we don't know exactly where we sit with the Trump administration on this issue. It was news to us as it was news to all of you last week when he talked about ag workers and hotel workers and needed to have a pathway. None of us got a heads up that was coming up in the staff meeting. I had members calling me saying, hey, what's going on? I said, you're finding out as I'm finding out, so I don't know. But it's a very complex decision-making process for a business owner to decide what do you do in the voting booth based on a whole list of issues that they have that affect their business.
I'd just add to that. I thought that was a perfect answer, right? You didn't mention energy policy, right, and how we focus on that particular issue, regulatory reforms, tax issues, looking at the tax cuts, reconciliation processes, right, and your own internal North Star value system that drives some of those decisions. Immigration is certainly one of those, but it is a myriad complex issue.
First of all, Rick is absolutely right? I mean, I think in general, it's a broader philosophy that goes even beyond just this specific issue. But on housing issues and housing affordability, I know that leading up into the presidential election, both candidates were really, from a housing affordability standpoint, saying the right things. And our national association certainly was working with both camps as we moved into the whole process. Now, of course, and Donald Trump was talking about deregulation, which was really the biggest thing that we want to deal with in the housing industry. But then, of course, then he gets elected, and now it's the immigration issue on one side, it's tariffs on the other, which also greatly affect housing costs and the whiplash that's going on with all of that. And now we're really waiting for him to kind of deal with the regulatory side of things, which we think he will. But one of the things that I found interesting, I heard this the other day, was that as far as making housing more affordable and available, one of his people was saying that one of the ways to do that is to deport all the people that are currently living in houses and make housing more available to others. Right. Therefore, so.
All right. Well, I'm going to take it one step further. Rick, I'm going to go to you. I like putting Rick in the box.
I'm trying to figure out what I did during session.
It started way before session, right? And I will say this, and you guys know this. When you go to the ballot box, it's not just these business decisions, right? We all bring with us our moral compass, our personal beliefs, our religious beliefs, our philosophical whatevers. I noticed we have clergy in the back. I probably should have put you up here, but this is the question. We've talked about this from a policy standpoint, but there is an underlying moral imperative to love our neighbor. How do we look at that moral imperative in the context of the business and legal issue? And I bring that to you, Rick, because I know your dad. And whenever I talk to your dad about this issue, inevitably this comes up. But is this a fair consideration? Does this not find itself in the ballot box? A little bit.
The moral aspect of this absolutely is a fair consideration, and is something that really is a piece of what goes into the decision-making process of our board of directors and our dairymen to take on this issue as our biggest policy issue. The reality is the majority of the dairymen in this country come from either Dutch or Portuguese immigrants post-World War II. And so for our dairymen, this issue is something that they look at and they see their key people that have been working for them for 20 years. And they see themselves, they see their parents, they see family members that immigrated to pursue the American dream that got them to where they're at and created this family business for them to operate today. And so, it's not a stretch for them to look at this issue and see themselves and see their own family. And there is that moral obligation to love your neighbor and do right by your neighbor. And I mean, the majority of our membership, the majority of the farming community are Christians. And that absolutely goes into the decision-making process on, why this is our top issue, on why we advocate for it and why we do it so passionately, because there is that piece of it too.
Okay. Anybody else want to touch it? Okay. So this question, I'm not familiar with this program, I have to admit, but the question is, there was once a Bracero program. What happened to it? Where is it at? What's the deal? Tell us about it. What happened? Where is it?
I know very little about the Bracero program, so
Okay.
I probably so little that it's a little dangerous to wade into those waters, other than it's not available to us anymore.
Okay. I'm sorry, whoever wrote the question, we're going to leave you high and dry a little bit on that one. Some of these we've answered. I'm trying to sort through just a little bit. We have seen recently what appears to be deporting of American citizens by mistake. How is that going to play in the overall moving forward, or what's going on there?
Oh,
And
yeah.
what's next?
I think if you're the Trump administration, they would say this is a large, fast-moving topic, that information comes in. You're seeing a lot around the debate around a Maryland man right now. Is he an MS-13 member or gang member? Is he not? Whose side do you listen to? Where do these issues come? You're going to see mistakes. Mistakes are going to happen in this process. They don't have the manpower, the resources, the intel to effectively carry out this policy. And so if you're thinking about worksite raids, you're thinking about broad-based immigration, issues around deportation of a vast segment of society, just be prepared. You're going to hear some of those headlines. They will lead, because obviously that is a very newsworthy bleeds read topic for the left, when you can cite a particular issue or an error with a deportation member trying to get somebody back from El Salvador right now, right? And that's all we're talking about today, one particular individual, and whether he was a gang member or not. There would be some on the right that would say he was here illegally. It doesn't matter whether he was or not, right? And so trying to unwrap those types of policy issues are going to be challenging. It's going to happen. Just be prepared.
Well, and to build on this, and you can all comment on this, but there is another question, what's happened with executive orders since the Trump administration's taken over is a changing of legal statuses, right? Unfortunately, with executive order, we've flip-flopped, right? Because some who were illegal before, made legal by the Obama administration, now suddenly illegal again. It can't be good for the economy. It can't be good for those who are looking to the U.S. government for guidance.
Yeah.
It can't be good for overall policy. Any comment on that stuff?
Yeah, executive orders are a horrific way to try and govern. Let's be really clear. They have a place. There are certain areas where having a president on either side stand up, issue a proclamation through executive order has a place. Significant policy implications, including these vexing pragmatic issues like immigration, is not where it needs to be done. It rests in Congress. It's Congress's responsibility. They need to own that. So what you're seeing happen right now with this president through executive order, I can promise you, when you see President Newsom or somebody else in 3 years, they're going to unwind every single one of these. And the pendulum will swing back the other way. We're going to start there as we start thinking about President Vance or whoever's next on the Republican side come back in. We want to get past that, right? And that is the whole premise and value prop of what we're trying to do. These issues impact every one of the industries that we represent, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's bio-life sciences, whether it's the home builders. You talked about regulatory reform, reducing housing costs to potential first-time home buyers. That is critically important, right? It is the number one financial issue that a young couple can take to ready themselves for economic success. So reducing those costs, speed to market, right? Getting more houses in the inventory are great through regulatory reform, but the problem is if tariffs drive supply chain issues and there's no workforce because we've deported those that are actually building the houses, you've gone the wrong direction. And that's what we're trying to advocate for, because you've now flipped the script and housing prices are going to exponentially blow through the roof. You can't fix that through executive order. We need Congress's activity and action.
Go ahead, Ken.
Anecdotal story. This won't surprise any of you, but going back to the rhetoric and the action that's going on, there are certain communities in this state now where I know that foreign workers, whether they're legal or not, simply will not go into those communities now. We're facing a situation where some of our home builders cannot get the guys they need to come and do the work because they're afraid to leave their homes at the moment, really, for fear that they're going to get swept up by ICE. And so, that's at least the immediate unfortunate effect of all this stuff that's going on right now, I think.
Okay, they're telling me 5 more minutes. I got about 15 more cards up here, so I apologize for that. Let's do 2 more quick questions. The SAVE Act. This is a 2-part. Does it target minorities of varying minority communities, transgender, you name it? And have we seen a lot of illegal immigrant voting in the United States that you know of?
Yeah, the SAVE Act, for those that may not have seen that slide roll through quickly, is around securing the American voting process to ensure that votes are being cast by U.S. citizens, right? And that's a particular issue that became obviously very important in the stolen election conversations that we saw in the previous election. There are some abuses, right? We hear about some challenges. Somebody that received a ballot from a deceased member that lived in the house prior to them. Again, as I mentioned, the same conversation around an error in deporting somebody that shouldn't have been deported. You're going to have voting irregularities. They were obviously, the critics of the SAVE Act will certainly claim that it will tamper down and will minimize minority vote participation, period, right? Because there's a concern around how it impacts minority communities across this country. I think on the right, they would completely argue that we have to show our driver's license at 3,000 different places where you need to go. I had to go to the hotel today to check in, right? I need your driver's license. So there are those that would firmly believe if you're going to cast, which is an incredibly important right to cast a vote as a U.S. citizen, that we should be showing identification. That's what they're aiming to accomplish. There could be some unintended consequences, certainly.
I would just say from a high level, be savvy in how you consume your news. If you have a bill that has 110 Republican congressmen that are sponsoring and 0 Democrats, you're probably not going to find 7 Democrats in the Senate to go along with the 53 Republicans for this to become law. So I would just be savvy about how you're consuming your news and look at what's the possibility of becoming reality and what is probably messaging to a base. And both parties are guilty of doing this, but I would just be aware of what's possibly messaging to a base and what has a possibility of becoming law.
Okay, last question. The question is, we've talked a lot about federal policy, what the national government's doing. What can be done in Idaho? What can be done in the Idaho legislature to help us address these problems in Idaho? And I'll put my 2 cents in, but I want to hear from the genius, the brilliant Ken Burgess.
Oh, I thought you were talking about me for a second there.
He hasn't picked on you at all tonight.
Well, I was due. I do think that the Idaho legislature took a reasonable step this last year in at least formalizing the relationships between local law enforcement and ICE, right? Because I do think that obviously there is a role to play for those local law enforcement agencies when they deal with the dangerous criminal, illegal alien, and the processes that have to go forward in terms of dealing with that person and ultimately deporting them. As you know, of course, that law was challenged 20 minutes after it was signed into law by the governor. It was legally challenged, largely because the argument was that, in fact, those local law enforcement agencies don't have a role and should not play a role in that. But I think at least in terms of some security and peace of mind with the citizens, I think it was a reasonable thing to do, probably.
I think one of the things I want to make sure you understand where and why state biz execs exist, right? And people are like, well, do you focus on state policy? Are you advocating at the Idaho legislature? State business executives is focusing on where things actually get done, but through that lens at the federal level. Executives within the state, whether you're in the dairy, the farming, the ag, manufacturing, financial services, healthcare, technology, all of these areas where you have effective leaderships that have the eyes, ears, voices of their congressional delegation, their governors. You also have to realize this administration right now is pushing things to states. If you think about block granting on infrastructure, if you think about Department of Ed and changes and potentially abolishing Department of Ed and pushing things down to the state level, think about immigration and policy, whether it's around licensure, whether it's around driver's license, around access to tuition, education, in-state tuition. Those are the areas where state governments are going to have a greater say within this administration. So I think there's a lot that can be done. Part of these regional grants and ideas of how we elevate that voice locally on these important issues where we can have a say and be impactful.
So I would say the legislature, we had a good start last year with passing Joint Memorial 102 to, signal to our delegation in DC that we want them to work on this issue. I think the more the legislature can indicate to our delegation in DC that they have support and cover back home on this issue and that they want to see movement on this at a federal issue, that's one of the best things the legislature could do. You had a bill, we haven't talked about it tonight, but you had a bill introduced by Representatives Rabel and Crane that they both knew was completely unconstitutional, but it was essentially a bill that proposed to enact visa programs authorized by the state for ag workers. Everybody knew it was completely unconstitutional, but it was to try and drive the conversation that we need Congress to do this because we can't do it at a state level. The state doesn't have the authority to issue visas. That's an authority completely reserved for the federal government. And so the more we can do to try and signal to our conservative Republicans in DC that they have support back home and that we're going to, support them engaging on this issue and coming to responsible reforms and responsible decision making, that's the best that we can ask of our legislature. Because outside of that, largely all they can do is make the situation worse by working on enforcement issues, and they can make the number of workers here fewer, but they can't make the number of workers here greater. So they can't help a whole lot beyond that.
Well, I appreciate hearing. I wanted to hear my colleagues kind of talk about that. It is a real challenge. You do have folks from home, like I said, your constituents wanting you to do something. The fact of the matter is the Idaho legislature has very little power to do something about it. The legislation that has gone through has been my legislation, to be honest with you. Working with the business community, working with my colleagues in the Senate. Senate Joint Memorial 102 was my legislation, calling on the federal government to get their act together, to secure the border, to do something meaningful with immigration reform, to help our ag community. And we took that piece of legislation to Washington, D.C., and we pleaded with members of Congress to do something. That was 2024. In the last legislative session, I carried the ICE Act. And, what that's meant to do is to relieve pressure on this issue in Idaho, calling again on, really trying to deal with the immigration on the places where I think we can all agree. And that is those who are really committing dangerous crime in Idaho need to be deported. That's kind of the thrust of the bill. And that was, as was said, immediately challenged in federal court, and I mean immediately upon passage. And it's because of these issues between the federal government and the state government. So it's a real challenge to try to get something through the state legislature that is not deemed to be the federal government's purview. So I think we're going to continue to have that challenge, and that's the best answer to the question I can give you. It's a real struggle between the two, the federal government and the state government. So I want to thank you for being here again, and let's give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you, Chanel, and thanks for all the organizers. Please travel safely. Again, thanks for being here. Thank you. Thank you. Nice talk. Well.